All
All
right. Well,
right.
we are back with our final chapter in this Advent season. We've been looking at Jesus as the hope of the world. I've been interviewing the whole time, but today I get to turn it over to Austin D. Hill, who will be asking me the questions this time. So, Austin, take it away.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be able to turn the tables here, and we're just mixing everything up this week. We're at home instead of in my church office. The internet was crummy there, and now that we're here, my cat Miley insists on being a part of this too. So it's going to be an interesting experience for us. But Stu, I've been looking forward to this all month long, knowing that I was going to get to turn the tables here. So,
Sounds good. All right, let's do it.
yeah. Well, so let me just first ask, what was your experience like in preparing for this? As you know, you and I had been talking about the theme all along, and then going through that last week. Just how did that experience go?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's been an interesting transition for me as someone who used to be preaching every week to now not. Next time I preach will be on Joel 9th on Joel 9th, on January 9th for our friend Joel, mutual friend of ours. But I really think these guides are helpful in a number of ways. I think one, they're helpful because they give a chance for us to be in the text and then also connecting the text to everyday life in the sort of in real time in a way that obviously a commentary can't do. I do think you mentioned this way that we do it, this AIM methodology, which Scott Bullock came up with. I can't take credit for it, but I think it really does a number of good things for pastors. One is it makes sure that they start with this grounding in the context so that they don't do eisegesis as much as they do exegesis, making sure they understand what's really happening in the text. Because it was interesting. A couple months ago, I was leading a group of lay pastors through training through my denomination, and it was interesting looking at a sermon. It was the first week we were looking at this idea of exegesis, and we were actually in someone's sermon. And I realized, if you get the exegesis wrong, and this person, it wasn't terrible, but maybe he was a little bit off. If you get the exegesis wrong, that's going to impact your interpretation of the text, which is then going to impact your illustration of the text, which is then going to impact your application of the text. And so, if you get any of those wrong, if you don't start in the right place by really understanding what's happening in the original text as best you can, it's going to sort of lead you on a path actually that's going to go not in perhaps the best direction. So I think one of the keys to this is once we have that grounding in what the actual context of the passage is, you're really set up so that you can take advantage of either your own sort of stories and illustrations from your own life, or like the library, the pastor's workshop that's got all this other content that you can kind of bring into your sermon as you're trying to bring it to life and connect it to your congregation.
Yeah, and I think that really is huge, especially for these prophetic passages that we've been looking at here in Advent, because they are so multi-layered, and that they really had a specific meaning from these prophets in the time they were written. And I think we sometimes incorrectly assume that prophecy is always future oriented, that prophecy must mean like left behind kind of stuff, where talking about the end days or whatever else. But prophecy at first, I mean, these were words to the people of Israel and Judah. So there's that portion of it. Then there's this application to what this means about Jesus, our Messiah, and then we take it to our day today. So that AIM setup, I think, really works well for these prophetic texts, especially here in Advent. And so kind of related to that, then let's dig into that ancient context. Tell us a little bit about Micah, because it's been fun each week hearing the perspective that each of these prophets are coming from. So what should we know about where Micah is coming from?
So Micah is sort of in a similar context as some of the other prophets of the time, in that he's in the 8th century, probably late or early 8th century. So he's he's really around as the Assyrian Empire is coming into its full force. And he's there as the Northern Kingdom ultimately falls in 722 BC or BCE. And so he's having to watch and see that this growing sort of foreign power that's very close by geographically. Now, this is kind of I'm going to admit something. I'm a nerd. That's probably already fairly clear, but my nerddom goes pretty far in that, last Christmas, I was actually reading like a little primer on the Assyrian Empire for fun, which is not what most normal people do, but that is just, again, the heights of my nerddom. And, the Assyrian Empire is really fascinating, but it was and is essentially where, we get the word Assyria today. So it's got this long legacy of impacting that region. But they were a pretty nasty empire in terms of the way that they dealt with their the people that they conquered, the people they fought in battle. And so they were really a people not to be trifled with. I don't know if they get the press, in terms of like ancient empires in the same way a Rome would, or to go to that time in Egypt or even a Babylon. But Assyria, they had actually dominated that entire region. They had dominated all the way up to Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, all the way down to Babylon. And so they had this really powerful military that was essentially giving its neighbors two options. One, we destroy you, and the other is you end up paying us essentially large tributes to keep us from destroying you. So Micah, is a prophet from a small little town, and now the name is kind of fallen away from me, but near Bethlehem, I believe it is. And now here's an interesting fact. It's this small little town in Judah, and it's really close to a town called Gad. Now, if that name sounds a little bit familiar, it's because that's where Goliath was from. So Goliath of Gad, and then you've got Bethlehem, and then Micah's town, which is I think it's like Shechem or Neshtem, or I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly what the name is. But all to say, this kind of gets into the sort of one of the main themes of this text, right? That God, the God of Israel, the Yahweh, is a God who really enjoys working through not the biggest powerful, not the Goliaths of the world, not the Assyrias of the world, but actually through the small, seemingly insignificant to bring about his sort of purposes. And that's, it just connects so well to Jesus's kingdom mentality. Who is great in the kingdom of heaven? It's not the proud and the wealthy and the rich and the well-connected, right? It's the meek, it's the poor in spirit. It's so, I guess I really see some really strong connections in this text, and I'm kind of getting off track a little bit, but
well, no, I mean, you're kind of just getting ahead of where we're going to go. I mean, which is great too. But I mean,
yeah,
I do really think that idea of having to pay tribute in order to basically stay alive in the face of these brutal oppressors, the Assyrians, who were notorious for how violent they were. I think that really is huge, though, because there's this temptation to place our trust in these kind of political machinations and in these other powers and alliances. And we see that throughout this entire era. And that again goes back to what you'd said earlier with starting with the context, because it's as we do that, we can see so many parallels to the temptations that we find in the church here today. Looking to the gurus, looking to the next big thing, whatever way that we can kind of try to survive. I mean, even thinking to make it a little bit political here, the way that we have various political alliances and the assumptions we have culturally that to be a faithful Christian, one must be a part of any particular political party. And I see that so connected to what the people of Israel were trying to do in order to survive against these brutal foreign armies as they were invading. And I think you miss that if you just gloss over the context and just say, oh, well, this is a passage about Jesus, our Messiah, and let's just move right there. So I think starting where you start there is really vital.
Yeah, absolutely. And you always have to be careful with these interpretive connections, right? Between that sort of context and what does that mean for us? I think the one you just did was perfect about that connection to the way in which we often look to, like you said, the guru, the tall steeple pastors who are going to sort of have all the answers. But I think there's another way to think about it is, Israel was a country that was meant to be, its strength was meant to be its relationship with God, first and foremost. And so you get, David and others in the Psalms, right, saying like, our trust is not in chariots, which was at the time, the latest sort of military technology. So we could say our trust is not in, nuclear bombs or jetpacks or jet propulsion, whatever technology it happens to be, right? But that our trust is in Christ. Now, that's somewhat conceptual, abstract, but there are opportunities in our lives, in our everyday ordinary lives, when we do have the chance, where God is essentially putting us in a situation where, well, he's not putting us in, we're in these situations where we can trust in God, or we can trust in our own strength, or we can trust in maybe even an alliance or a relationship that's questionable, that where the ethics are not there. And so the question is, in those circumstances, where are we are we just going to give in to what's easy, or are we going to place our trust in Christ? And even if that means we might have to suffer in the short term, the long term is more important. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah. And I think the way I would say that is, I think we sometimes in the church think that when Jesus just says, whoever wants to follow me must give up their life. I'm kind of paraphrasing Matthew 10:38 and 39. I think that's not just an individual thing. I think that's a call for the institutional church as well. And we sometimes maybe assume that we need to just continue to have this institution thrive at any cost, because the institution therefore is the body of Christ. But I think we need to be willing to sacrifice in order to be faithful and to actually follow the way of Jesus.
Yeah, and that's such a great point. The fact that the people who are listening to this are generally probably pastors and other ministry leaders, and how you make decisions as a if you're a part of especially if you're part of an elder board, or even if you're just a part of different ministry committees or whatnot, the way that you make decisions, it says a lot about your priorities and your ethics, what you stand for. And so it's a good question. Do you it's a good opportunity, or it's a place to really ask the question of like, okay, are we discerning where God's going? Or are we just kind of going with the flow? And that's a hard one, because it's easy just to make decisions. It's nowhere near as easy to discern in community what God is calling us to. And maybe not all decisions need to be, discerned through like significant time of prayer and discussion, but certainly some should be. And so, yeah, so and there are situations for leaders of churches where they're going to come up against circumstances where there's an easy path with maybe some moral question marks, and then there's a harder path that is more the path of the cross and more the path of obedience to Christ. And sometimes it might be that the pastor is the only one that's going to stand for this path, but that's the call. And so, just something to think about. This can hopefully be encouraging to you, not beyond just your sermon prep, but as you deal with decision making, power dynamics, all of that in your church. But anyways, speaking of power dynamics, you had a question about that, or question related to justice, and
Well, Yeah, and we've already been kind of hinting at this a little bit, I think, with the need to pay tribute that the people of Judah were doing in order to stay alive. But because of that, that brought about a lot of systemic injustices and a lot of issues of kind of different power dynamics that were present in their day. So briefly touch on what some of those injustices were that the nation of Israel was kind of neglecting essentially, before we then kind of move to Jesus and then even more to our day, which we've kind of been already there. But yeah, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I've been actually reading through the Torah recently, doing one of those Bible in a year audio deals. And, it's very clear, from the outset that the people of Israel to be a people of justice, a people who do not neglect the foreigner, the stranger, the poor, do not, oppress the poor, but it's easier said than done sometimes. And obviously in Israel's long history, there's a lot of examples of that injustice. So the way that sort of has manifested itself in this text is, Micah is really has a word of judgment for Judah, because they're paying these these large payments to Assyria to sort of stave them off from attack, which is problematic for Micah, again, for two reasons, right? The first being, you're trusting in your money and not in the Lord to protect you. But then secondly, the way in which they were going about getting that money was disproportionately taxing the poor. Now, we live in a country that has at least what it calls a progressive tax system, where the more you make, the more you're at least supposed to make or pay in taxes. Well, in the ancient world, it tended to be the opposite. And for that, the reason for that being, the poor, of course, have little voice. The prophets and the word of God are the only people standing up for the poor, most likely, in these situations. Whereas the well-connected, the powerful, the rich, they're the ones, right, who are saying, you don't need to ask us to give too much money for this, this levy, maybe just a little bit, And so then what happens again is that the poor end up paying disproportionately much larger percentages of that that money, and really that is creating a sense of injustice. And it's interesting though I would say it's interesting to think about that in our context, because we do have a progressive tax system where you're supposed to pay more if you make more. But we do read these stories, right, of billionaires who pay. There's a story of Warren Buffett, who said he was paying less percentage-wise than his administrative assistant in taxes, and he said that's wrong. Of course, he's still doing it, right? He's still paying that, but that's because probably somewhere along the way, and this again isn't a partisan issue, wealthy people, they go to their leaders and they say, hey, don't close that loophole, or let's make sure that we make room for some of these different ways of us to keep our tax burdens low. So there is a connection there. Obviously you got to be careful with that, but justice again gets to, we all should be sort of paying our fair share. We should all be taken care of in the same way, and there shouldn't be favoritism going towards some over others, especially if it's a matter of wealth. Letter of James is pretty harsh on that. So that's what it should look like for us as followers of Christ in the new creation, is that we don't have that same kind of favoritism. But it just seems like we often, as the church, we do sort of buy into power. A lot of the times if we just will align with this group or that group, that's going to make us feel good. But all the while we're kind of losing our soul a little bit as it relates to, we're not really being honest and having integrity when it comes to these things. We just want our portion. And so I don't know, that's something for for folks to consider.
Yeah, I mean, I think the prophets of the Old Testament really challenge our core assumptions as 21st century American Christians, at least. And I think that's an ongoing challenge of any preacher in the US, is to find ways to, as gently as possible, so that people are still willing to hear what you have to say, kind of invite people into this new imagination, and to challenge some of the just core assumptions that are a part of our culture. I think of the phrase from Romans 12, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And as a teenager, I thought that was mainly like abstaining from drugs, sex, and rock and roll. And, while there might be some of that there, I think a lot of it more often is things like what you're talking about. And that we just assume, well, if I can get out of taxes, then great, because like that's how the government is set up. But this is talking, there might be some other ways of justice that we need to be thinking about, and that's an ongoing challenge. I think these texts here in Advent certainly speak to it, but they also do point us, I think, both directly and indirectly toward this hope in the Messiah. And just kind of being aware of the time here, as we're recording at least, say a little bit then about how this connects to Jesus, and especially with this idea of Bethlehem. That's probably where anyone reading this here on this fourth Sunday of Advent, getting so close to Christmas, and we're going to hear Bethlehem, and we're going to hear Christmas and the Christmas story loud and clear there. So connect some of those ideas there with what Bethlehem means, just from the Hebrew, and what that might mean for us from the preaching angle.
Yeah, so Bethlehem, it's one of those words. If you took Hebrew, one of the first probably words you learn. It's a sort of a composite word, right? Of Beth, meaning house, and Lechem, meaning bread, right? So house of bread. Bread obviously is this sort of staple food. I was actually just reading a book by a guy here locally who has a book called Broken Blessed, Broken. Man, I'm just off today. Glenn is his name, and I can't remember his last name at the moment, but he starts his book by really just bringing up this idea of bread as what makes it special is in some ways its commonness. It's sort of this basic staple that enables life to human life and other life, obviously animal life, to exist. It is so core and sort of central to a person living in Jesus' time or in Micah's time, right? That it's not a surprise that sort of God would sort of choose this place, this small little place, though, where the house of bread, where the Savior of the world would come from. And again, the smallness is really important. That it's interesting in the Hebrew, and I'm no Hebrew scholar, but the word that's used to describe Bethlehem, Ephrathah, or however you say it, the littlest. The word is actually means like trifling. It's this extremely sort of small, inconsequential place, supposedly, in the eyes of the world, in our eyes, but in God's eyes, it's completely different. There's a quote I put at the top of my guide that I just think is so helpful, from Daniel Simonson. He says, the small size of Bethlehem, remember the house of bread, reminds one of a common biblical theme. When God is about to do something great, human estimates of status, size, power, and influence are completely irrelevant. In fact, God often deliberately chooses someone whom we would probably dismiss as the most unlikely candidate for carrying out God's mission. I think this comes back to, again, what we were talking about, where do we look to for our inspiration? Where do we look to sort of help us with the uncertainties and the unknowns in a COVID world and all of this? Is it just the person that's always looking for attention, that has something to say, even if what they say isn't really worth listening to? Or is it someone that's maybe a little more wise and a little bit more careful with their words, but someone who really has soaked in life and has the scars to show for it, but really sees God's work. And they're this kind of person, man, woman. They're not going to be the kind of people that you're going to find on, the top blogs or podcasts probably, but they're out there and they can be so helpful. And again, because they understand this principle, what we just talked about, it's from the little places, it's the small and seemingly insignificant that God is going to do his greatest work. Jesus.
And I think,
oh, go ahead.
sorry. Well, I
No,
think
go.
this is huge for this season in the church too, because at least extrapolating from my experience here in Fort Dodge, Iowa, numbers, which we all kind of have our own relationship with numbers, they're not what they were before COVID. And the temptation in Bible studies, Sunday morning worship, youth group, whatever it might be, is to look around and to lament, to mourn and say, I remember what it used to be. And what more could we do if people would just come back? But this line from Micah here about these insignificant places and God still accomplishing so much in this littlest of this town among all the clans, that shows us that no matter how insignificant we might be feeling, God can still accomplish incredible things. And so our numbers might be down. We have a Tuesday morning men's Bible study, and we used this passage just this morning. And there have been some weeks earlier this year where there'd be 2 or 3 of us. And this is a men's group that over the years, used to have 25, 30 guys of all ages. And it's a few guys who are in retirement age. And we've thought, should we even keep this thing going? And this was just a potent reminder to us today that look what God accomplished with 12 disciples in the ministry that Jesus had. And at the end of Jesus' life, as he's on the cross, he was abandoned even by those. And then to make that connection back to this bread, Jesus offering of himself as this bread of life, that we would eat his body and drink his blood, that we would be nourished. The one who nourishes the world was one who did not have significance. And I think that's a word we need to hear today in this Advent season, especially when it's so easy to look at what once was, which is something that the Israelites also struggled with when they finally did return from exile. The older ones looked as the temple had been rebuilt, and they said, this is nothing compared to what it used to be. That's a feeling that we all really struggle with, I think, post-COVID or whatever we are in currently. So I think there's a lot of hope that comes to us in this passage here with this connection of Jesus being this one coming out of Bethlehem, the house of bread, offering himself for the world.
Well, I think you kind of summarized this up really well for us, especially considering I know you're on a little bit of a time crunch. We apologize, it's a lot not longer, but we had some technical difficulties. But beautiful. I think there's a lot of hope in this text, and it's I'm trying to remember who it was, if it was C.S. Lewis or someone else that said, it's always good to read books not from your own time. Like every third book you read should be, I think it was C.S. Lewis who said this.
That sounds like something he'd say.
And reading this text is essentially an exercise in doing that and getting an alternate vision for that questions some of our assumptions, questions some of our the leanings and even the longings of our hearts. Sometimes we all want success, we all want to grow, we all want fruit, but God doesn't say that will just come. It's not guaranteed, but we can be faithful in the midst. We can do our best to learn and grow and hope and pray and ask God to flower to water the fields and bring about a harvest. But in the meantime, we still are called to be faithful and to see that in the smallest of places, God is at work and he's doing something that can actually sort of reverberate throughout all of history. And so I hope this is a good word for all of you today. And Austin, thank you so much for sort of spearheading this entire series. It's been I know a lot of work for you, but hopefully a blessing. And we are so grateful for you. And yeah, well, we'll see you maybe guys in Lent when we have something else to present to you. Well, thank you, Austin. You have a great day.
Yeah, you too. It's been my pleasure. And my cat Miley says hello. You may have heard her snoring, or you may have heard my wife doing stuff in the background. We've got our elders coming over for an end of the year dinner here in about 45 minutes.
Well, I pray that maybe this text is an encouragement as you gather with your elders, and have a great one. All right.
Yeah.
Bye,
All
guys.
right. We'll see you.